Welcome everyone. It is nice to welcome you to our event, How to Launch a Career in Marketing, Breaking into Marketing. I don't know, Edward, if you agreed with this. I think I just came up with this title to make it a little bit more enticing, but we want to learn about your really exciting career. I know a little bit about that already from our email exchange in marketing, and you did quite like many different things. And yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about it. I will not like introduce you because you will introduce yourself during this talk very much. But yes, so I think if it's okay with you, Edward, I will kind of see if there's any questions coming up in the chat, and then I'll just like see, or sometimes I often have questions as well. And so just if that's okay, I would just interrupt you and ask you at that spot because I think that's often better for following this talk. Yeah, and thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, please do interrupt if you've got questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. If anyone's very keen to come off mute and ask me directly, you won't disrupt my flow. That's fine. Please do. So yeah, please let me know if you can see my slides, if that's come through.
Yes, yes, very
Brilliant.
well.
So I am currently a PhD student here at City St George's in psychology and the Centre for Food Policy. And my research here as a PhD student is focused on how to encourage particularly young men to adopt more sustainable and healthier diets. This is after a career or building on a career of about 15 years in marketing, and particularly in some of the big businesses that do marketing around the UK. So what I wanted to start off with as well is an invitation that during these minutes that we will spend together to ask yourself the question of, is there something in here or alluded to in this talk which you think you might enjoy and find interesting and fulfilling? Because a lot of people have uh, a lot of careers and stressful times in marketing and in other jobs, and find themselves then trying to find their passion or their purpose later on in life. So I would invite you to think about, actually, where is that crossover between marketing and things that you're passionate about, so that you are working on something which you find fulfilling, inherently rewarding, and hopefully good fun at the same time. Um, so I thought I would start off with a little bit about the amorphous world that is marketing. Lots of people aren't very able to articulate very well what marketing is. And I think that's because it's such a broad umbrella which captures so many different disciplines and skill sets. So, where I will begin is looking at something that I've actually adapted from an online agency, which is looking at the difference between in-house, which is referred to as being client side. So, for example, being a manufacturer or in a company or in an organization in marketing, and separately, what it's like to be agency side. I've been both. Most people don't work both sides. And actually, that decision of would I rather work within a company or in an agency is a very impactful one, which is worthwhile reflecting on a little bit at the outset because it's likely to set you on a different path. So, in-house marketing, a marketing manager, marketing assistant, as we start out when we begin on our marketing journeys, looks at making things happen, looks at strategy. They are the ultimate brand guardians who become a deep specialist in what is it that makes a brand what it is, how does it show up, how does it speak. You'll be likely managing agencies or a series of agencies. You'll be very closely tied to business performance if you're in a for-profit business, particularly normally sales targets. And you as well would have specific sales targets that you would need to achieve. You would also likely be responsible for communications. So that might be advertising, it might be how you speak in PR opportunities, getting stories out there about your organization in the wider world through the news, for example. You will likely, as this is often the case and not for the better, but people who enter the any organization earlier on or younger are often given social media as a responsibility because there is a perception that younger people are more equipped and better informed to look after social and digital channels for better and for worse. People who work in house will write copy. By copy, I mean text. So it could be writing emails, it could be writing posts on social, it could be writing brochures or catalogs, depending on the business. It might be updating the website, running photo shoots, running events, and as well, critically, budget management, making sure that you have enough money to deliver the plans that you commit to and that you design up for the year. This is the sort of thing that you would be responsible for if you worked in a place like Unilever, where I did for a long time. If you were in-house, if you worked at Adidas or another big company, or if you worked in the marketing department at City, it wouldn't be that far away. On the flip side, then, you might work in an agency. So a couple of agencies that I really like are Adam and Eve. They do the John Lewis adverts, so they're quite well known. And another one is KRPT. Disclosure, I do work for them as a consultant. So these are creative agencies. If you work in an agency, as opposed to needing to work across all of the disciplines of marketing a little bit, and therefore being a generalist, in an agency, you tend to become a specialist. So you might specialize in, for example, advertising strategy. Where is the right place for a company's advert to be seen to make sure that it will reach the people that it needs to reach to encourage someone to buy something that they need to buy? You might become a specialist in creating really excellent content, which might be on YouTube or on TikTok or uh, wherever, which other social channels you might like it to be. You might be a branding specialist. You could be all about design and use your knowledge of the psychology of color, for example, and how that means that you're able to communicate with people through the representations of different elements of design theory. Or you might become an SEO, a search engine optimizing specialist. So those are people who produce lots of copy and make websites work really hard to get you higher and higher and higher up the rankings when people are searching for a product or a service, particularly relevant in business to business marketing and particularly relevant in things like financial services. So, insurance. Normally, we try not to think about insurance until we need it. And so, things like when people are actually searching for information is a really important channel. So, have a think. Do you want to be a generalist that covers a little bit of everything, or do you want to be a specialist who is an expert in copy or social or websites? It's an important decision. You can swap, as I mentioned. I have worked both sides, but it's not the easiest transition. And often when people are moving from in-house to agency or vice versa, it's not an opportunity to take a step up in terms of salary. It's not an opportunity to take a step up in terms of seniority in an organization. It's often a sideways or even an upwards move. So something to be aware of. Very good experience to have experienced both sides. Now, as I mentioned, marketing covers an absolutely enormous range of different jobs. So I put this together thinking, okay, well, as a psychology student as well, you're really well equipped. You've got a lot of very relevant skills that put you in a fabulous position to already be talking with a good level of authority about some of the skills and expertise which is required when you're working in marketing. So you'll already probably be very strong at things like data analysis, critical thinking. You already have an understanding of ethical considerations and storytelling. So, first and most obviously is consumer behavior and market research. You are probably all fully equipped to walk into a career which is looking in at market research, analysis, or consumer insight research. You are all, I'm sure, well equipped to run qualitative or quantitative studies using things like surveys or interviews or running focus groups based on the studies which you have been part of so far. So lots of excellent, really transferable skills that you've already acquired right there. In a slightly different space, we can look at brand management and strategy. So this is often what lots of people think of stereotypically a marketing career, including. So this is where I started out. I was a assistant brand manager initially, and then brand manager, and then went into marketing strategy. So it's looking at how do you visually and textually and strategically show up as a business in all of its touch points so that you are intentionally designing a brand experience for potential and hopefully future customers. Then another space which is very well known is around creative and communications. This could be, as I mentioned before, writing copy, could be creating what people see about an organization on socials. It could also be looking at PR and getting stories in the news about what you're working on, really building out the advertising strategy as well. Building the adverts. It's fabulous fun going and being part of an advertising shoot for the first half an hour. And by day three, it's quite tiring. But really good, interesting, fabulous discipline right there. And there are more, but the last one that I will touch on as well, and I'm sure you, with your quantitative skills, will be very well placed to explore a career in this avenue already, is around looking at digital, increasingly a growing space in marketing, but looking at data-driven marketing. So using the data which powers particularly online advertising to be as effective as it possibly can and convert people from not even aware of a product or a service to then suddenly buying into your product with the lowest cost possible and often in the shortest time frame possible. Um, Hopefully there's something in here that you're looking at and thinking, oh, that could be interesting. I might enjoy that. If not, this is a warning sign that maybe marketing isn't quite the career for you. But keep with me. So my next question for you is around what industry you want to work in, and actually, very importantly, what industry don't you want to work in? And I ask you that for two reasons. First of all, Mark Antony was is attributed as saying that if you do what you love, then you'll never work a day in your life. Fabulous claim. Few people achieve that. But also from an interview perspective, I think it's really important that you find something at the beginning of your career that you're interested and that you're passionate in, because if you are coming to an interview, to a selection process by a recruiter, then they're going to want to see passion and interest and engagement and relevant reflections and thoughts about the sector that you're applying for, about the company that you're applying for. If you haven't got that passion or interest in the first place, having done hundreds and hundreds of interviews in my time and recruited people in my various roles, if someone doesn't show up as interested or caring about what they're doing, then they might give really good answers, but I'm not going to give them the job. And if you can choose a product or a service or a category that you're really, really interested in the first place, then you're already going to have a good baseline level of knowledge and awareness about what it is. And you're just going to do much better at those earlier interviews. So definitely suggest spending some time, not now, but please do ask yourself, what do I really love? What do I do that doesn't feel like work? What are you excited to talk about? And that age old question of what would I do if I didn't need to be paid for it? If you can find answers to these which fit particularly in a marketing space or any other space, frankly, that is absolutely brilliant. And your passion will be more rewarding than anything else you can find in a career space. Turning
Ed,
to me a little bit.
could I ask a question about this? So basically, if I go back, you would like, let's say I'm interested in marketing. I feel like, okay, there's a space, maybe for me. And then I think about, let's say I'm like the prototypical man. Okay. I like football, computer games, cars, and so on. And then I would say, uh, is that a prototypical man? I think so, probably, right? But then, and food, maybe that's like a car. But then you would suggest basically reaching out to companies that are doing these things, or is like how do I go from okay, I want to do marketing, these are my interests to this that how I identify like companies to work with, or I don't know, there might be also agencies specialized in certain content, or like how, yeah.
So I think it's both of those things that you mentioned right there. If you're I remember when I was in at university and deciding where I wanted to go next, it just feels like anything is practically possible. And coming with a good degree from psychology from a good university, as everyone on this call will be, yeah, you've got such a broad breadth of choices. And thinking, so I was really passionate about food. Like I really, really care far too much about food. Think about it all the time. Love cooking it. Love where it comes from. So for me, I have pursued a career in food intentionally because it speaks to my passion point, and therefore it's just naturally easier for me to get excited about it and interested about it, and I can speak about uh, food and food supply chains in a way that people can see, and energy is infectious. So
Mm.
yeah, if you have a real passion point for sports or computer games, I mean, fabulous, great. Like there, that already opens up huge areas and two gigantic industries right there that you could easily explore and would be likely to be more fun for you to work in than, for example, feminine hygiene products, which is also a big industry, but not necessarily the right fit.
Okay, great, thank you.
Um, No, oh, good. It's a good question. And thank you for the clarifying. So, yeah, I started off when I was 18, 19. I wasn't ready to go to university yet. So I moved to Spain. Then I moved back to France where I'd gone to school for a while. I then got a job over in Indonesia. Was having a great time, but was conscious that I wanted to go and do something a little bit different with my life. So I then went to the University of Exeter, where I studied business, not psychology. Apologies. And while I was there, I was really conscious of needing to make sure that I was pursuing a profile that would be attractive for a future employer. So a few things that I did included one of my projects, which I had at in my undergraduate. I focused on actually doing it on a category. So it was washing detergent, but it was an assignment for one of my modules. But then I was able to talk about it in my in my graduate program selection process. So have a think. Is there a way that you might be able to use something that you're really passionate about and build that into a more meaningful example by tailoring one of your assignments to a relevant product category. So you've got that relevant story. I was also part of Raising and Giving, which is one of the biggest organizations at the Students' Union there. It's all about raising money for charity. It was very clearly with an objective of making sure that I had examples of leadership because all graduate programs everywhere want you to talk about leadership and how it is that you have driven a project forward. So have a think about what opportunities you might have while you're still studying. Um, Outside of that, in my summer holidays, I did work experience with JP Morgan. I thought I wanted to go and work for a bank. Found out very, very quickly on day three, I definitely didn't want to go and work for a bank, and that was not the right fit for me. I thought I'd like to go and earn the money that you earn if you go and work in a bank. I learned quickly I didn't care that much. um, and I also did some work in summer holidays with English First, my employer from when I'd been in Indonesia. And then also approached a agency very close to where my mum and dad were living. And it meant that I was able to go and get some work experience one summer doing not the most exciting or insightful work, but it was relevant to marketing. So that really set me apart in terms of having relevant industry experience. And all of this together helped me to secure a placement on Unilever's graduate program, which is called their Future Leaders program. In other things, I'll just give you a few highlights, but I worked for Ben and Jerry's ice cream for 5.5 years. I was about 10 kilos heavier at the time, but it was very delicious. um, and I also worked on their communications and their campaigning. I then went on to work for Pukka Herbs, which is an organic herbal wellness brand, best known for their teas. More recently, was at Wahaca, which is Britain's number one most sustainable restaurant business, but a Mexican food chain particularly well known in London. So, and that brought me all culminated together in me actually then making the jump to come back to academia and to study here at City. I wanted to focus in a little bit more though at this point. How is it that you take your experience and then transfer that into actually getting onto a graduate scheme? And being honest, it's these 2 points. It's what can you do while you're studying, and what can you do in addition to your studies that makes your profile really interesting for a graduate scheme or for another any other employer really. So first of all, not particularly glamorous, but you need really good examples. And you need really good examples of the skills which are relevant to marketing. You're in a fabulous position as psychology, I think mainly undergrads, that you will already have through the nature of your course experience in lots of these. Maybe not so much the first one, leadership. When and how have you led a project beyond your education? How have you made something happen, transformed an idea into a real output out in the real world? You need some very good examples of that to show that you have more strings to your bow than your undergraduate degree. How have you measured results? On this, you probably can rely on your undergrad experience here. But what experience have you got of making something happen and then analyzing the data and actually measuring what happened? It's really key, and everything that's done in marketing should be measured in some size, shape, or form. Campaign management, again, maybe a tricky one to get hold of without more specific marketing experience. But if you are part of one of the societies at university and you've needed to recruit more members for your society, maybe you've put on some events, you've run campaigns, you'll have those examples. If you haven't, then maybe you're part of a dance troupe outside of university, and maybe you could arrange an event, or you work with a charity outside of university, and you have recruited people to fundraise. Find some examples of some real campaigns that you have run and how you've measured the results, because that will again set you apart in terms of having a very good, tangible example of what marketing looks like. Working well under pressure, ideally in addition to university exams, but finding some examples because marketing is at times a high pressured environment. Companies love talking about how you manage difficult people, difficult characters. Now, I know there's no one difficult at all that works at City University, so you'll have to look a bit further to find examples. But I'm sure you have got it within you to find a couple. Selling something. At the end of the day, marketing comes down to convincing someone to normally part with their cash. So have some examples of how you've sold something effectively. And then managing a budget is also really handy to have. We mentioned this earlier with Andreas, but and something that I did, which was very simple and meant that it was not very high competition. I looked near to the place that I was living for nearby agencies, and I approached them and said, "Can I come and work as your junior assistant's assistant for summer?" It wasn't. I mean, the money was fine. I think I was paid more than minimum wage, and well, I know it was at the time. And there are. I looked it up before today. There's nearly 8,000 marketing agencies across London. So if you look nearby, you'll probably find a few which aren't too difficult or too expensive for you to get to. And you could approach them. I worked for a random website agency, which is no longer in business, but it gave me really, really useful, tangible experience. Also, you're going to need to think of your examples and to explain them in a way which is going to land effectively with the recruiter, with the company that you're talking to. And the best way of doing that is to use the language of the company that you're speaking to. Pretty much every company out there will articulate what its values are. They will use different ways of saying this. This is the example of Adidas that I found. They talk about what makes a winning team. They talk about their culture, they talk about their purpose, and they talk about their values. So they talk about courage, ownership, innovation, team play, integrity, and respect. So the examples of behavior that you need to be able to prepare for an interview with Adidas is an example of you using an example of you using ownership, innovation, etc. The websites tell you all of this. It's just hopefully a little insight into how to crack the code of what the website's telling you for what you need to prepare. And the other bonus is that preparing examples for company values is pretty easy. You might be thinking, oh, good God, how on earth am I going to be able to prepare a different example? Because every company has got different values. The wonderful thing is, actually, they don't. Companies have always got a combination of pretty much these eight things and maybe one different one. But it's always integrity, being honest. It's always almost having something about the customer, the consumer. Uh, Generally, something about agility, being adaptable. Creativity is common in marketing. Excellence, being committed to doing really good work. Teamwork, data-led decisions, and getting things done, i.e., having some real get up and go and having what at least in my world was always referred to as a bias for action. So if you can prepare examples for these, check it against the values, and then the important bit is to use the company language in your interview because then it already sounds like you're already part of the team. A simple bit of prep, but it's not quick. And again, just going back to Adidas to look a little bit more, when I was looking on their website earlier, I by accident stumbled across the fact they even tell you what some of their common interview questions are. So, just to reiterate, if you are looking particularly for a grad scheme, they will be giving out a lot of information in terms of how to prepare, go through it really, really thoroughly. And if you're not going for a grad scheme, lots of these companies will still be opening up other opportunities and they will give you lots and lots of opportunity to prepare very thoroughly for your interviews. It's particularly important that you do that because you need brilliant examples. Um, what most companies want is for you to use something called the STAR method. You may have heard this already. So when you're giving an answer of tell me about to a question like tell me about a time when you've managed a campaign, you talk about the situation, the task at hand, the actions that you individually took when you use sentences that start with I and what you personally did. And then you look and then you speak to the results. It's very important. And I'm going to beg you to practice and practice and practice this. I say that because, right, so I've been in marketing for 15 years, but when I applied in my year for the Unilever Future Leaders Program, there were over 11,000 applicants for every single place in my year. So what I'm saying is competition is hot. So that's why I'm saying you need brilliant examples because if you want to show up as the best to get the job, then that polish, that slightly better delivery can really make the difference. So I mentioned Unilever quite a lot. So fast moving consumer goods is the term that they use. It effectively means anything which is sold, bought in a supermarket. Really important in that world to understand groceries and supermarkets. If you've had a job in a supermarket, they absolutely loved that in the selection process and wanted you to talk about it because it meant that you understood an industry far better than I did going in. And for lots of businesses, not all, they're really focused on something called new product development. So it's going to be the new flavor or the new shape or the new size of what they make. And a lot of their business is focused on exactly that. So in FMCG, they are quite committed to their innovation funnel. Andreas invited me to talk about some of my favorite examples. So one of my favorite passion projects, which I had because I'm really, really care about sustainable food, was introducing the non-dairy vegan version of Ben and Jerry's ice cream across Europe. And really good fun project. I think practically every business in this sector has this very structured stage gate process. Just something for you to be aware of, but looking at how you follow a clear process to get to an achieved shared outcome, starting with an idea, building a business case, putting together some development and research and development to actually create a product, testing it, validating it with a customer, and then what do you need to launch it so people actually buy it at the end. that I thought this might be a useful framework for you to have at the back of your mind if you're thinking about some of your campaigns or some of your marketing. I was asked as well to talk about what does a week like look like as a marketing person in a big corporation. It's a very difficult question because in marketing things are very, very varied, and I would say pretty much no 2 days ever look the same. There are a few rhythms and patterns. So there are often key team meetings on Monday. There's often early in the week preparation and reports that you share about your projects for leadership team meetings, often happening on a Tuesday. Um, there's ever such a lot in marketing in a big corporation of cross-functional team project plans, and as a project lead, chasing people at its least glamorous. It means walking over to someone's desk or sending people repeated emails asking them again and again to do something that they promised they were going to do 2 weeks ago and haven't. There will be leadership meetings. Honestly, when you start out, you won't be in those, but it's useful to find out what did happen in them. Lots of project team meetings, which you'll probably run very early on. And so sending out lots of minutes, following up with actions, making sure people do what they said that they would do in more or less the time frame that they said they would do it is a really important skill. Lots and lots of preparing slides. I hope you like PowerPoint. If you hate PowerPoint, marketing might I'm not actually joking here. My marketing in a big corporation really might not be the right place because the number of slide decks that we put together is gigantic. You'll have meetings with our research and development team. So I worked loads with food scientists. That was fabulous fun for me. You might run risk assessments, and you'll have meetings around consumer insights, understanding more the people who actually will use your product at the end of the day. Meetings with agencies, visiting with visits with customers. If you're working in a big business, a single week will not go by without you having some form of mandatory training that you will need to join, some of which will be really fabulous and some of which will be eye-wateringly boring, but it is required. And some of it honestly is fabulous. It's worthwhile taking the bad for the best bits. You'll be responsible for budgets, so you'll have meetings with finance, and you'll have lots of opportunities to share feedback with agencies about how they put things together. So, in short, every week will be very varied and very different, but there's a little bit of a taste. From my perspective, yeah, my highlights were being in ice cream factories. I'm not really supposed to share some of these, but I thought I would anyway. So some of this is me in Greece, in Netherlands, in the USA, balancing tubs of ice cream in my head and other such things when it was midnight in factories trying to get something to work that wouldn't. But yeah, it was a good time. I also really loved working on things that were more than ice cream. So I've worked as part of the B Corp movement for a lot of my time and worked for a lot of businesses which campaign on issues which are important to them, which are not just about earning more money. I've spent quite a bit of time leading, for example, the European project on refugee welcome, which was very meaningful and rewarding for me. You'll work with brilliant people. I guarantee you'll have a very good time. You'll enjoy if you're working on a space that you're passionate about. So if it was in a sports relevant brand, you'll be talking and playing sports and having a great time. Mine was mainly about eating lots of food. And then from a personal development perspective, I've learned so much, particularly from my time when I was at Pukka, about things that deeply mattered to me. So I was very keen and interested in going to work for an organic food brand and one which was very focused on ways of managing health holistically, not just thinking of ourselves as people that manage health um, by taking pills, but really thinking about how do you prevent ever falling ill by really investing time and energy in wellness. So yeah, my time at Pucker was brilliant because of what it opened up to me in terms of learning opportunities. Low lights. I guarantee if you're in marketing, you will be a cost-effective brand ambassador and embarrassed to wear some stupid form of something and smile for random photos. It's not the worst thing by far, but it's part of it's part of the path. And exchanging late night emails about how your corporate tech is not working. I guarantee it's definitely not much fun, but hopefully you'll be working with lovely people who can share your pain if you are in a similar situation. What I wanted to finish and round off on, though, was re-inviting you to think about what is it that you're good at, what the world needs, and what you love, and finding the intersection with what you can be paid for with those. So in Japan, it's called your ikigai, and it's finding this purposeful, fulfilling, interesting job that fills your cup as much as it provides what you need to live a good and happy life. So, my three takeaways for you, my three recommendations are spend some real time thinking about and reflecting on what you love. Have a go at marketing. Get in touch with some local agencies, see how it goes. Hopefully, you'll have a fabulous time. And when you're getting ready for those interviews, you need to be the best if you're going to be the one which gets picked. So practice, practice, and practice. So, yeah, thanks very much. If anyone's got any questions, I'm very happy to take them. And if not, here are my contact details. I'm happy for you to reach out after say.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Could I ask you two quick follow-up questions?
Of
The
course.
first one is, so why now a PhD at City? Actually, I think it's kind of like that's where you started your talk with. Now you're back. Why did you leave? Like at least partially, it seems like you should still do consultant work and support the world of marketing and doing a PhD. Like I don't know, that would be interesting. I have one other, but that's completely different. Yes.
Yeah, I should have prepared a better answer for this one. I mean, being completely honest, I'm I followed my heart. I'm working on a topic which I think is deeply important, really fascinating, and a really good fun. It doesn't feel like work, and I've been in marketing for 15 years. I'm in a position, candidly, financially, where I don't need to be earning what I was last year. So a PhD is about 3 years, all being well. So I can afford to take this time to work on something that I really am passionate about, and hopefully take my career in more of a behavioral science direction, based more specifically on things that I'm really passionate about. And again, another piece of the story, being completely honest, is I got tired and annoyed of not being able to make the decisions that I wanted to because of the commercial imperative. If you need to make money, if you need to make profit, that can go in contrast with making what are more ethical decisions. And that is always a trade-off that at some points has been quite uncomfortable for me. So I'm taking a period of time where I don't have to worry so much about that trade-off.
Okay, fantastic. There's one question in the chat. Hi, Edward. If you were graduating now as a psychology student, which area of marketing would you be aiming for, taking into account growing areas, room for progression, AI is unlikely to take over, etc. Where do you see,
Very good
like,
question. If I have my crystal ball. So I, to be honest, I would still start where I did from a big business perspective, which was being an in-house brand manager, because it is you as much as agency expertise will be, for example, copywriting, it's nowhere near the industry it used to be. Um, Content generation is going to change hugely in terms of the role of AI. Um, Whereas someone in-house who is going to be the coordinator to weave that tapestry, if you will, of all of the many strings that comes together to create a a, a collective piece of art, picture, rug, whatever you want for the analogy. Yeah, I think the generalist in-house brand manager is not going to be easy to do away with, because there'll always need to be the coordination from my perspective. AI could prove me wrong. And again, the nice thing about being in a generalist space is, particularly early on in your career, you get to have a taste of pretty much everything. And then you can say, oh, actually, I want to I want to go and specialize in this, or I absolutely hate finance, so I'm not going to do anything which is on the financial end, but I'm brilliant at uh, advert development and creative or design. So then you can if you're not quite sure, then it's a nice way to set yourself up to have lots of different experiences and pursue the ones that you find most exciting.
All right, fantastic. I think my follow-up question is a little bit like, I mean, I don't know, maybe you could spend a minute or two talking about the impact, where you see it of AI. I think they have friends in agencies who work in agencies, and they saw, like, they have at least told me they see like dramatic cuts already in the content generation. I think examples of photo shootings are completely different now because you're not staging, you're just generating. And so, like, yeah, I don't know. Like, it's like, what's your take on like AI and marketing?
Yeah. I think, well, first of all, I'd say it's absolutely only the very beginning. So I think the things that we can assume might happen in 5 years' time, I think will be leaps and bounds further progressed than where we are presently. Um, and what else is going to happen? So my cousin's husband was a graphic designer for a very well-known tech company that bears the name of a much loved fruit, which he's not allowed to disclose. If you might be able to work out which one it is. And that whole department doesn't exist now.
Hmm.
And rather than being graphic designers, and rather he is a fabulous graphic designer, but he now writes prompts for graphic design through AI. So his métier, his skill in that space is now not really very relevant. So that's a complete fundamental shift. Yeah, as you mentioned, copywriting. So email marketing is supposed to be 100% automated relatively soon. Um, the targeting of adverts and advert content creation as well. There are rumors that that will be fully automated and won't exist in the same way anymore. Um, I mean, finance should be completely different, shouldn't it? That surely we should just have machines manage most of that function, so that our budget management doesn't need to be very difficult. If I think back to how many hours I spent in my early career sorting out, making sure that the right people were paid the right amount at the right time. Yeah, so I won't continue staring at my belly button and musing about what that what could happen there, but it will it will be extensive for sure. I can see that Benji's put another question in the chat, which I can answer. So Benji's asked, what would a long-term timeline look like for an in-house brand manager? And is the role only in the big companies, or do boutiques have similar roles? So yeah, really good question. I'm gonna answer it in the opposite order. So in terms of a brand manager or a marketing manager, almost every business has someone who is a marketing manager of some effect. So yeah, City has a marketing team. The RHS has a marketing team. Pretty much any brand that you can think of has a marketing team. From I don't know, even TikTok has their own marketing team. BBC has a marketing team. So and they are primarily brand managers. So lots and lots of opportunity and scope across any industry that I'm aware of, and a long term timeline.
Your career progression, maybe. I think, yeah.
Yeah. So normally you would start as an assistant brand manager, become a brand manager, become a senior marketing manager, and then become a marketing director. And then at the top of that would become a chief marketing officer. So that would be a very uh, linear set of jumps. Depending on the size of the business, that might be. Some people will obviously never make it to a chief marketing officer. Some people are happy in a some people find a role that they enjoy and stay at that sort of level. So that I wouldn't say there's any limit to progression there. It would be limited by ambition and opportunities.
Can I just add, Edward, that there's also lots of opportunity for moving out of the sector. So you could be working in one particular sector And then with that expertise and the transferable skills, you become very appealing. So, for example, there was a time when I think she was the chief marketing director of Burberry, and then she was recruited by Apple because they wanted her to help with the design of Apple products. So I think the thing to think about, and you mentioned this much earlier, is about the transferable skills that you're going to gain. And I think one of the things with marketing is it's a very people um, oriented job. There's a lot of stakeholder management. There's a lot of understanding the industry you're working in. There's almost like a consultancy approach to it. So you are actually making yourself much more marketable across different sectors, not just to remain in marketing. And that's been my personal observation of people I've worked with who were in marketing but have been quite successful in transferring that skill set to other roles, especially as as you rightly said, some of the more core marketing roles that we see might well change or disappear. Do you mind if I ask you a question? You almost did my job because everything you talked about from
Yes.
Ikigai and that
Yes.
develop,
Star method.
it
Yes.
was almost like you went through develop your career ideas, go and get some experience, explore them, find out if they're for you, and then evidence them in your applications. That's what we teach them from year one. It doesn't always land, but that's the aim. But it's that initial career idea. So when you went out and did your gap year, decided to do business, at what point did you make the decision that it's going to be marketing as opposed to finance or HR or operations? What was that? How did you come to that early career decision?
Well, I took 5.5 gap years, so it was a little bit more than one. But I was really not sure about what discipline I would be best suited to. I probably like many psychology students, I've got a wide set of skills. I'm quite good at maths and quant. I really like the people side, the qual side of things, and the clinching factor on marketing for me was, let's have a think. Um, I I knew that I liked a big variety, and I don't react well to doing the same thing day in day out, and marketing is one of the most varied disciplines in most businesses.
Mhm.
So that was positive, and an attraction for me. I knew I didn't want to go into a purely sales role. I thought that, naturally, personality type wise, I'm probably a slightly better fit for a sales role, but I wanted to have a more strategic input into what I was doing, and marketing is crafting the core proposition of a business. It's the fundamentals of the the strategy of how are we serving customers. So that for me felt like it was impactful and relevant and interesting. So that was important, and I was looking at lots of grad schemes. I was very clear that I wanted to go in on a grad scheme path because I wanted to get access to, being honest, a company investing a hell of a lot of money in me as an individual and my development early on in my career, because I thought that would set me up to achieve good things quickly. And I very deeply bought into the ethos of the CEO of Unilever at the time, who was a chap called Paul Polman, who was a real visionary in terms of business as a force for good, and believing that companies could do more than just make a profit. So, and he was from a marketing background as well, from Procter and Gamble. So that sort of came together. And then when you go through the applications as well and grad schemes, you'll quite quickly get kicked out if you haven't got the right
mm,
skill set
mm,
or value set for,
mm,
I wouldn't make it in finance or supply chain or sales in those
mm.
spaces either. So there's also a sort of natural aptitude which was relevant.
But it's really interesting. So you've got quite a lot of self-awareness of what was important to you in terms of that variety of job, or whilst you're good at sales, it wasn't quite what you're looking for, but also the values you talked about, the values aligning in terms of what Unilever and the vision they had beyond profit making. Um, and that you also wanted an organization where you could be developed. So, but that must have taken some research and some kind of reflection and looking, you know, I'm just trying to put myself in our psychology students' shoes who don't really know what marketing might entail versus, so how you go about doing that. There's quite a lot of proactive researching and speaking to people and reflecting on yourself. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I would love to say that there was an easy way to shortcut it, but
There isn't.
it's a very significant decision. We spend more time at work and spending time with people that we work with than our nearest and dearest, than our families often. So these are these are very significant decisions that we make sometimes without having reflected very much. I went to some careers fairs as well and spoke to different people who were in different sectors. I mentioned I went and did the work experience with JP Morgan and had a horrendous time. I did work experience with a law firm, hated it. Uh, that was when I was a teenager and realized I thought initially I wanted to go in to be a lawyer because when I was a kid there was a show called Ally McBeal, which I thought was really cool, and I wanted to go and do that and
I
live in the
remember that show.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I don't think any of the students will be aware, so we'll move on from that one. But it was very it was really cool. It made being a lawyer look really fun. It's nothing like that. It's absolutely awful. Um, for someone like me, because it is such focused, quiet, highly detailed nitpicking through complex, difficult to read text. That was really not what I wanted to do. And lots of people do assure me that they enjoy it. I've got a very good friend who's a lawyer who thinks it's brilliant. Don't understand how he likes it. But yes, to go back to Angela's point, talking to people for me was easy for me because I like talking to people. So I spoke to people who had experience and also listened to them because part of it is a cultural fit, and you need to fit with a culture for someone to want to hire you into that role, whether that's right or wrong. That is the world that we live in. So, uh, making sure that you come across as the type of person that would do that type of job is relevant, and friends and family who are a good bit older are often well placed to be able to share those sorts of reflections.
All right, fantastic. I think we're like, Faisal, sorry, do you have a question? Otherwise,
I just have a really quick question about the transferable skills. I was so happy you mentioned that because I feel like our students aren't fully aware of the transferable skills that they're developing on the course and how that relates to marketing. But how explicit would they need to be? Would employers be aware that they've got these skills that would be relevant to marketing, or is that something that they need to make really explicit in their CVs and their applications?
Very good question. I would try and find a way to put it out in the most explicit terms that you can. No employer is going to know anything about you that you haven't explicitly told them. Keep it brief. So I know it's that wonderful double-edged sword, right? And say as much as you can and use almost no words. But the particular there's no point telling someone you know how to use SPSS, which I assume students probably learn on their undergrad. But talking about skilled using advanced statistical analysis goes, oh, that sounds impressive. So finding short, pithy terms to describe highly relevant, desirable skills is yeah, definitely worthwhile fitting in an application, an answer to an interview question or a CV if that makes more sense.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. I think we're done. That was amazing. Edward, thank you so much. I'm very curious to learn more about your PhD project, but I think that's not part of this talk. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. That was really, really rich. And even if students do not become marketing managers or whatever, I think there was like a lot of really cool content in there that will help them to kind of gain a direction, find their direction. So I really, really appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining us.